Why is Fidel Castro remembered as a hero across much of Africa?
Fidel Castro, it seems to Africans, was generally committed or interested in their liberation.
That's because under Castro's leadership, Cuba sent tens of thousands of troops and medical brigades to African countries to support the fight for independence from colonial rule. Sean Jacobs is the founding editor of Africa is a Country.
Normally what would happen is if a foreign entity comes to Africa and says that we can assist you with their freedom, they want something. This was not part of the Cuban rationale.
Though he was demonized by the West and faced a reported 600+ assassination attempts, Castro's foreign policy is still celebrated around the world, and his legacy of exporting doctors, not bombs, continues. Former South African President Nelson Mandela even called Castro a source of inspiration to all freedom-loving people.
Cuba adopted a foreign policy that was called internationalism. Cuba deliberately set out to assist other parts of the world where people were still fighting for their freedom.
Among others, Cuban troops joined and supported battles against the French in Algeria and the Portuguese in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. They also provided crucial support for the defeat of apartheid forces in South Africa and neighboring countries.
In the mid-1970s, South Africa was occupying Namibia, and it had begun to occupy the southern part of Angola. They were colluding with a rebel movement that was funded by the US called UNITA.
At this point, the US was allied with the South African apartheid regime. The People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola called on Cuba for help as the US-backed and South African apartheid forces sought control of the newly independent country. Cuban forces twice defeated the invading South African apartheid army in Angola in 1976 and 1988. Those victories reinvigorated the anti-apartheid movement against racist white minority rule back in South Africa.
At least more than half of the people in Cuba are of African descent. And so having an army of black people defeat this very powerful white, army that is representative of white supremacy, supported by the US, and defeating them in that part of the world, and then that leading to the independence of Namibia. South Africa withdraws from Namibia, withdraws from South Angola, and then you see the release of Nelson Mandela from jail. So if you're in that part of the world, that's how you think of Fidel Castro.
Thousands of Cubans died while fighting in Africa.
There's a long history of people interacting with Cubans, not as invaders, but as showing friendship and solidarity.
Cuba supported the independence and development of some former African colonies by providing doctors, nurses, teachers, engineers, and soldiers.
What was the legacy of the US in that part of the world? It was sabotage, it was funding violent groups. If you were an unfortunate victim of their violence, it was called collateral damage. They supported the South African government, the white South African government. Nelson Mandela was still on a US terrorist watch list up until the early 2000s. So if you contrast that hypocrisy and undermining, if you want, the people of Africa with the approach of the Cubans, anybody who's from that part of the world could see what's going on.
Despite suffering under a decades-long US blockade, Cuba continues to send medical teams around the world, from Haiti to Italy. And while the West lagged behind, it was Cuban doctors who were leading the fight against the Ebola outbreak in West Africa.
It's the same principle of internationalism, sending medical help, sending engineers. It wasn't about gaining an advantage. This was purely about solidarity. I always joke that if Africa was a country, then Fidel Castro would be seen as one of its national heroes.